The Desna River provided a natural barrier, and the bridges near the city were vital for communications between northern Ukraine and the Central Soviet regions. For the Wehrmacht, seizing Chernihiv would allow secure crossings and an opportunity to envelop Kiev from the north, linking with other German thrusts coming from the west. For the Red Army, the city was a defensive anchor. Holding it meant retaining control over a significant river line, maintaining supply and evacuation routes, and preserving a base from which counterattacks could be staged. The Soviet Union had not anticipated the scale and speed of the German assault. In June 1941, Chernihiv lay within the Kiev Special Military District, which was soon reorganized as the Southwestern Front. Soviet defenses were arranged along the frontier, but they were thin, dispersed, and heavily reliant on incomplete fortification belts. Chernihiv thus became part of a broader German effort to cut off the Southwestern Front from the rest of Soviet forces. For the Soviets, the defense of northern Ukraine was divided between several armies, including the 5th and 21st Armies, which operated in the region of Gomel and the Desna. Their objectives were to stabilize the front, prevent German penetration toward Kiev, and, if possible, counterattack to regain lost territory. Yet the realities of the campaign were grim. The Red Army had suffered catastrophic losses in personnel and equipment during the first weeks of Barbarossa. By mid-July, Soviet records indicated the loss of over 11,000 tanks and 9,000 aircraft across all fronts. Many formations defending Chernihiv were understrength, consisting of newly mobilized reservists with limited training, supported by depleted remnants of divisions already engaged in retreat battles. Supplies were strained, and the coordination between infantry, armor, and artillery was often disrupted. Public sentiment in Chernihiv reflected the shock of sudden war. Evacuation measures were chaotic. Factories were dismantled when possible and sent east, but much equipment was abandoned. Civilians faced shortages, as food and fuel were redirected to military needs. Local Communist Party officials attempted to mobilize workers for fortification construction, building trenches, obstacles, and strongpoints along the Desna. The NKVD organized evacuations of administrative institutions and, in some cases, deportations of individuals deemed politically unreliable. For the population, war arrived swiftly, with air raids, columns of retreating soldiers, and news of German advances creating an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty. The terrain around Chernihiv also shaped the coming struggle. The Desna River, with its width and swampy banks, created natural defensive advantages, but also logistical difficulties for both sides. Bridges were limited, and their control or destruction would play a decisive role. Forested areas around the river and rolling countryside provided opportunities for ambushes and partisan activity, conditions that would later shape resistance after the German occupation. By late July and early August 1941, the German advance had drawn steadily closer to the city. Soviet forces, though battered, attempted to regroup, aware that Chernihiv was both a symbolic and strategic position. The city's defense was not planned as a prolonged fortress-style stand, but rather as part of a larger delaying effort. Nevertheless, Chernihiv was destined to become a scene of heavy fighting. The siege that unfolded in late summer 1941 was not merely a local battle, but part of the broader contest for Kiev and control of the Dnieper Basin. The launch of Operation Barbarossa on 22 June 1941 immediately brought northern Ukraine into the war zone. German forces of Army Group Center advanced rapidly across Belorussia, breaking through Soviet defensive lines and creating deep penetrations. By early July, after the battles at Minsk and Smolensk, the German 2nd Army and 2nd Panzer Group began moving south and east, threatening the regions of Gomel and Chernihiv. For the Soviet Southwestern Front, commanded by General Mikhail Kirponos, the first weeks of the war were marked by desperate retreats and fragmented counterattacks, with Chernihiv increasingly exposed to the oncoming pressure. The opening phase of the German advance toward Chernihiv began in the second half of July, when elements of the 2nd Army pushed toward the Desna River. German objectives included securing river crossings, establishing bridgeheads, and pushing toward the northern approaches to Kiev. The 2nd Panzer Group, led by General Heinz Guderian, played a key role in these operations, using mechanized formations to outflank Soviet defensive positions and threaten deeper encirclements. German forces deployed for the approach included several infantry divisions and armored units equipped with Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks, supported by motorized infantry and artillery. Air support came from Luftflotte 2, which bombed Soviet troop concentrations, rail junctions, and bridges to paralyze mobility and supply. On the Soviet side, the defense of the Chernihiv sector fell primarily to the 5th Army and the remnants of the 21st Army. These formations were already weakened by engagements in Belarus and along the Dnieper. Soviet rifle divisions often had only 6,000 men remaining instead of their full strength of 14,000. Many units lacked sufficient anti-tank guns, with only a handful of 45mm pieces available to cover broad sectors of the front. Tanks from Mechanized Corps had been heavily reduced. Reports indicate that entire corps were down to fewer than 50 operational vehicles by mid-July. Artillery support was scattered, with shortages of ammunition further reducing effectiveness. Communication between headquarters and frontline units was frequently disrupted due to Luftwaffe strikes on radio posts and field telephone lines. The first direct clashes near Chernihiv began with probing attacks by German advance guards in late July. Soviet commanders attempted to organize delaying actions along the approaches to the city, deploying troops in prepared field positions and using the natural defenses of rivers and forests. The Desna River presented an obstacle, but German engineers were well prepared for river operations. Pontoon bridges and assault boats were moved forward, while reconnaissance units searched for crossing points. The Red Army responded by mining likely crossing sites and preparing demolitions for permanent bridges in Chernihiv itself. Soviet engineers, supported by local civilians, fortified the western approaches to the city, creating trenches, bunkers, and anti-tank obstacles. Civilians began to experience the direct effects of the campaign in this early stage. German air raids struck Chernihiv's railway station, industrial facilities, and residential quarters, causing casualties and spreading panic. Soviet authorities attempted to maintain order by organizing evacuations of factories and state institutions. Trains carrying machinery, archives, and workers left eastward toward Bryansk and beyond, but many were destroyed en route by air attacks. Refugee flows increased, with thousands of families leaving the city in carts, on foot, or in overcrowded wagons. Yet many residents remained, either unwilling or unable to leave, facing the prospect of siege and bombardment. The German advance created growing pressure on Soviet defenses. Reports from the southwestern front to Moscow in late July indicated heavy losses and the inability to form continuous defensive lines. Instead, Soviet units fought in isolated sectors, often encircled or bypassed by German mobile forces. Nevertheless, Soviet command recognized the importance of Chernihiv and attempted to hold the city at all costs, hoping to buy time for reorganizing deeper defensive positions along the Dnieper. Reinforcements were ordered into the area, though many were newly mobilized reservists with minimal training. These forces lacked heavy weapons, but were used to fill gaps and strengthen the perimeter around the city. By early August, the front around Chernihiv became more fluid. German mobile detachments advanced rapidly, but Soviet defenders mounted localized counterattacks to disrupt crossings and slow the momentum. Near the villages west of the city, Soviet rifle units, supported by a handful of tanks, launched counterstrikes against German bridgeheads, inflicting losses but suffering heavily under German artillery and air superiority. The Luftwaffe maintained near total control of the skies, intercepting Soviet aircraft and bombing troop movements. Soviet air regiments, flying outdated I-16 and MiG-3 fighters, suffered heavy attrition, further limiting the ability to protect Chernihiv from bombardment. The command structures on both sides began to reveal their approaches. The German Second Army relied on steady infantry advances combined with concentrated armored thrusts to create breakthroughs. Guderian emphasized rapid exploitation, urging his panzer units to bypass resistance and push deeper toward the Desna. On the Soviet side, General Kirponos sought to strengthen the defensive belt around Chernihiv, but the fragmented state of his forces and constant retreats limited his ability to coordinate. Stalin's directives to hold every position, regardless of losses, compelled Soviet commanders to commit underprepared units into battles they could scarcely sustain. By mid-August, Chernihiv was effectively on the front line. The opening phase had transitioned from rapid German advances to direct clashes around the Desna crossings. The Soviet command still hoped to prevent a breakthrough, but German forces were tightening their grip on the approaches. The city's defenders prepared for what was becoming increasingly inevitable, a protracted struggle for control of Chernihiv, one that would pit diminishing Soviet resources against the full momentum of the German invasion. The struggle for Chernihiv cannot be understood without examining the broader strategic calculations of both the German and Soviet commands in the summer of 1941. The city was not simply a provincial urban center, but a point of convergence for multiple operational objectives. Army Group Center, commanded by Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, was the main striking force, and within its southern sector operated the 2nd Army under General Maximilian von Weichs and the 2nd Panzer Group commanded by General Heinz Guderian. Their mission, while officially tied to the push toward Moscow, was also shaped by the necessity of securing the flank against Soviet forces defending Kiev. German planners therefore identified Chernihiv as a key objective. Its bridges and road network connected Gomel, Bryansk, and Kiev. By capturing it, the Wehrmacht could channel its forces southward and link up with Army Group South, creating conditions for a massive encirclement. The operational approach of the German command relied on mobility and coordination between armored and infantry forces. Guderian's panzer divisions were expected to drive toward the Desna, secure crossings, and exploit into the Soviet rear, while infantry formations consolidated gains and eliminated resistance. German doctrine emphasized speed, concentration of force, and combined arms tactics. Logistics played a crucial role in these calculations. The German supply system depended heavily on railroads, and securing Chernihiv's rail links was seen as essential for moving fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements forward. Engineers were tasked with preparing for bridge construction and repairs, anticipating Soviet demolitions. The Luftwaffe's role was to neutralize Soviet air power, interdict reinforcements, and soften defenses through bombing campaigns. Every element of the German plan reflected the belief that decisive battles of annihilation could be won through rapid encirclement and destruction of Soviet armies. The Soviet strategic perspective differed fundamentally. Following the initial shock of Barbarossa, the Soviet General Staff and the Southwestern Front leadership sought to slow the German advance and prevent encirclements. Supply lines were extended across devastated terrain, with railroads needing conversion to German gauge and bridges often destroyed by retreating Soviets. Fuel shortages became a recurring problem, limiting the operational reach of panzer divisions. The expectation of rapid Soviet collapse was challenged by the stubbornness of Soviet resistance, even when poorly equipped. German intelligence often underestimated the number of Soviet units in the field, failing to recognize the depth of Soviet mobilization. In the Chernihiv sector, this meant that German forces anticipated lighter resistance than they encountered, facing determined defenses and repeated counterattacks that disrupted their timetables. Another critical element of planning involved the coordination between different German army groups. Army Group Center's drive toward Chernihiv was meant to link with Army Group South's operations around Kiev. Newspapers published stories of workers joining the front lines and peasants sabotaging enemy operations. While these accounts were often exaggerated, they reflected a strategic intent to maintain morale, inspire resistance, and frame the defense of the city as part of a larger patriotic struggle. In the end, the planning and objectives of both sides converged on Chernihiv in late summer 1941. For the Germans, the city was a stepping stone toward the encirclement of Kiev and the consolidation of control over northern Ukraine. For the Soviets, it was a line to be held as long as possible, a delaying bastion in a war of survival. The disparity in material strength was evident, but so too was the determination to resist. As the Wehrmacht prepared to storm the city, and as Soviet defenders fortified every street and bridge, the stage was set for one of the hardest fought battles in northern Ukraine during the opening year of the Eastern Front. Artillery units were brought forward, deploying 105mm and 150mm howitzers to pound suspected strongpoints. Engineers scouted riverbanks for potential crossings, moving pontoon equipment into position. On 12 to 14 August, German forces attempted initial crossings near small villages west of Chernihiv, facing immediate Soviet counterfire. Soviet artillery, though limited, opened fire from concealed positions, while infantry entrenched along the riverbanks resisted fiercely. The Germans were forced to withdraw after suffering losses to mines and anti-tank obstacles placed by Soviet engineers. The Red Army's defensive effort was organized by elements of the Fifth Army and reinforced by local militia. Soviet rifle divisions deployed in depth, with trenches, dugouts, and fortified buildings prepared as firing positions. Anti-tank ditches were dug on approaches to the city, and bridges were rigged with explosives. The defenders relied heavily on natural terrain. The swampy banks of the Desna slowed German vehicles, while wooded areas offered cover for ambushes. Soviet commanders ordered that every crossing attempt be contested, regardless of losses. NKVD detachments monitored discipline and prevented unauthorized retreats. The early clashes demonstrated that although the Soviet forces were understrength and poorly supplied, they retained the ability to disrupt German operations. Luftwaffe bombing campaigns intensified throughout this period. Chernihiv was struck repeatedly, with bombs falling on the central railway station, industrial facilities, and residential quarters. The attacks caused hundreds of civilian casualties and destroyed warehouses containing food and military supplies. German air superiority allowed reconnaissance flights to map Soviet defensive lines, while ground attack aircraft strafed troop movements. The lack of effective Soviet air cover was stark. By August, local fighter regiments could only field a handful of serviceable I-16 and MiG-3 aircraft, often flying without proper coordination or radio communication. Most sorties ended with heavy losses. The Luftwaffe's dominance made it increasingly difficult for Soviet units to move reinforcements or supplies in daylight. Despite these disadvantages, Soviet counterattacks were launched against German bridgeheads. On 17 to 18 August, a Soviet rifle regiment supported by several T-26 tanks struck at a German infantry battalion attempting to cross near the village of Shestovitsia. The counterattack inflicted casualties and temporarily destroyed pontoon equipment, forcing the Germans to fall back. However, Luftwaffe intervention quickly reversed the situation. Stuka dive bombers attacked the Soviet positions, knocking out tanks and scattering infantry. The regiment suffered severe losses, losing most of its vehicles and nearly half of its personnel. This pattern would repeat itself in subsequent engagements. Local Soviet successes undermined by overwhelming German air and artillery firepower. The fighting soon spread into the outer suburbs and satellite villages of Chernihiv. German infantry pressed forward methodically, supported by tanks and artillery barrages. Soviet defenders fought from trenches, houses, and improvised bunkers, attempting to delay each advance. In the village of Berezanka, Soviet units held out for 3 days against repeated German assaults. Machine gun nests and sniper positions inflicted dozens of German casualties before the defenders were overrun. Soviet reports described entire battalions reduced to a few hundred men. Yet the time bought by such resistance allowed reinforcements to prepare inner defensive belts around the city proper. Civilian involvement in the defense grew during these early engagements. Workers and students were mobilized to build fortifications, erect barricades, and dig communication trenches. Women and elderly residents transported ammunition and cared for the wounded. The atmosphere in Chernihiv became one of siege preparation. Evacuation of archives and factories continued under bombardment, but many civilians could not leave. Instead, they prepared to endure bombardment and urban combat. German shelling and bombing increasingly targeted residential areas, both to break morale and to disrupt supply efforts. By late August, the Germans intensified their attempts to breach the Soviet defenses. Artillery concentrations were massed along the Desna, with heavy batteries delivering sustained barrages. On 24th August, after a day-long bombardment, German infantry stormed positions north of the city. Soviet defenders resisted stubbornly, forcing close-quarters combat in trenches and farmsteads. Losses mounted on both sides, with German reports acknowledging the destruction of entire platoons during house-to-house fighting. Soviet accounts noted that rifle divisions were reduced to under 3,000 men, while artillery units were firing their last stocks of shells. Still, organized defense held, and Chernihiv itself remained in Soviet hands. The early engagements also highlighted the challenges faced by German logistics. Rapid advances had stretched supply lines, and fuel shortages limited the operational range of panzer units. German commanders became increasingly reliant on infantry divisions to carry out frontal assaults, slowing the pace of operations. The destruction of bridges by retreating Soviet engineers forced German units to construct temporary pontoons, delaying movements. These delays frustrated Guderian, who pressed his subordinates to accelerate the advance in order to meet broader objectives in Ukraine. The stubborn resistance at Chernihiv was consuming time and resources that German planners had intended to dedicate to the Kiev encirclement. For the Soviets, the first clashes were both costly and strategically valuable. Though divisions were decimated, their resistance prevented the Germans from seizing Chernihiv quickly. Every day the city remained in Soviet hands, complicated German coordination with Army Group South. Reports to the Stavka emphasized the need to hold Chernihiv at all costs, linking the city's defense directly to the survival of Kiev. Reinforcements continued to trickle in, though they were often poorly equipped and lacked heavy weapons. Militia battalions armed with rifles from local depots and Molotov cocktails were deployed to fill gaps. Despite their inadequacy, these units contributed to the overall defense, raising the cost of German advances. The psychological dimension of these early clashes cannot be overlooked. For German troops, accustomed to rapid victories in Belarus, the stubborn resistance around Chernihiv came as a surprise. Accounts describe frustration at the difficulty of securing crossings and eliminating defenders who refused to surrender. For Soviet soldiers and civilians, the ability to resist a powerful enemy provided a measure of morale, even as losses mounted. Propaganda broadcasts from Moscow hailed Chernihiv as a symbol of defiance, linking its defense to the broader struggle against invasion. By the end of August 1941, the stage was set for a full-scale siege. The Germans had established bridgeheads on the western bank and tightened their grip on the approaches, but the city itself remained under Soviet control. The first engagements had demonstrated both the vulnerability of the Red Army and its capacity for determined defense. As reinforcements arrived for both sides, the fighting would escalate into one of the most intense urban battles of the early campaign in northern Ukraine. Chernihiv, though battered, had not fallen quickly, and the Germans prepared for the next phase, a concentrated assault to crush resistance and open the road toward Kiev. By early September 1941, the battle for Chernihiv entered a more destructive and exhausting stage. What had begun with probing clashes and contested crossings now escalated into continuous bombardments, larger assaults, and the tightening of the German grip on the city. The Wehrmacht committed greater resources to break the stubborn Soviet defense, while the Red Army attempted to reinforce and prolong resistance despite catastrophic losses. For both armies, the struggle at Chernihiv reflected not only tactical confrontation, but also the broader strategic crisis unfolding across Ukraine, where German encirclement maneuvers threatened the southwestern front. The escalation was marked above all by the intensification of German air and artillery bombardment. Beginning in the first days of September, the Luftwaffe launched near-daily raids on Chernihiv. Stuka dive bombers, supported by twin-engine bombers, struck the railway station, bridges across the Desna, and supply depots. Factories still operating inside the city were hit, and whole residential quarters were reduced to rubble. Fires burned uncontrolled for days. Civilian casualties grew into the thousands as bombs fell on crowded shelters and evacuation convoys. German artillery, concentrated along the western bank, delivered sustained shelling. Entire districts were subjected to saturation fire, with 105 mm and 150 mm howitzers demolishing defensive positions. The psychological impact was immense. Soviet reports noted declining morale among troops constantly under bombardment, while civilians dug deep shelters in cellars, attempting to survive the daily destruction. On the ground, German infantry intensified their assaults. Several divisions, including the 131st and 293rd Infantry Divisions, rotated through the siege operations. Their objective was to encircle the city completely, cutting off all routes south and east. German forces pressed from the west and north, while reconnaissance detachments probed the southern approaches. Panzer units were used sparingly within the urban perimeter due to the difficulties of river crossings and narrow streets, but armored support remained decisive in breaking through fortified villages on the outskirts. Engineers brought forward pontoon bridges and ferries, gradually expanding German control across the Desna. Each crossing was contested by Soviet artillery and rifle fire, but German superiority in coordination and firepower gave them an advantage. The Soviet defenders by this stage were stretched beyond capacity. The Fifth Army had been reduced by previous battles to barely half its original strength. Soviet engineers attempted to maintain pontoon bridges under fire, but many were destroyed shortly after construction. The severing of bridges made evacuation and resupply nearly impossible. Trains carrying refugees and wounded were repeatedly attacked. Eyewitness accounts describe burning carriages filled with civilians. The city's connection with the wider Soviet rear was effectively severed, leaving defenders isolated. Inside Chernihiv, defensive efforts took on the character of urban warfare. Soviet units fortified streets, prepared barricades from rubble, and established strongpoints in factories, schools, and administrative buildings. Sniper teams operated from rooftops, while machine gun nests covered intersections. The NKVD maintained order by patrolling rear areas, preventing desertion, and in some cases executing soldiers accused of cowardice. Civilian volunteers, organized into worker battalions, manned positions with rifles and grenades. These improvised forces, while poorly trained, added to the defenders' numbers and slowed German advances through certain districts. Reports indicate that German patrols entering western suburbs met unexpected resistance, suffering casualties in house-to-house combat. Nevertheless, the German superiority in coordination gradually eroded Soviet defenses. Artillery and airstrikes systematically destroyed strongpoints before infantry advanced. German tactics involved encircling small pockets of resistance, cutting them off with machine gun fire, and then eliminating them with grenades and flamethrowers. The use of flamethrowers in particular had a devastating effect on morale, forcing defenders from fortified positions. By 8 or 9 September, German infantry had entered several northern neighborhoods, driving Soviet units back toward the city center. Soviet counterattacks, often conducted by exhausted and underarmed battalions, failed to regain lost ground. Losses were enormous. Entire regiments ceased to exist as effective fighting forces. The crisis for the Soviet command was compounded by developments outside Chernihiv. German armored thrusts to the south were closing in on Kiev, threatening to encircle the southwestern front. The defense of Chernihiv, while delaying the enemy, risked becoming a trap. Soviet high command debated whether to withdraw forces to preserve manpower for the larger battle. However, Stalin's orders remained uncompromising: no retreat without explicit authorization. As a result, defenders were forced to continue fighting under hopeless conditions, buying time for Kiev's defense, but at the cost of their own destruction. Partisan activity also began to emerge during this stage. Groups of civilians and soldiers cut off from their units began organizing sabotage against German supply lines. Bridges were mined, and ambushes were set against small German detachments. By mid-September, Chernihiv was engulfed in flames and ruins. The escalation of bombardments and assaults had reduced much of the city to rubble. Civilian suffering reached its peak, with thousands dead and tens of thousands displaced. Soviet defenders continued to hold out in pockets, fighting street by street, yet the crisis had reached a breaking point. German forces had secured crossings over the Desna, cut supply routes, and penetrated the city's outer defenses. The final collapse was approaching. Though the resistance of Chernihiv had already achieved its strategic purpose, it had delayed the German timetable and forced them to commit resources that might otherwise have been used elsewhere. By the second week of September 1941, the battle for Chernihiv reached its most intense and destructive phase. What had been a series of probing attacks and escalating clashes now culminated in full-scale attempts by the Wehrmacht to capture the city. The siege turned into a concentrated urban campaign marked by continuous bombardments, street fighting, and the gradual exhaustion of Soviet defenders. For the Germans, the capture of Chernihiv was no longer simply a tactical objective, but a necessity for securing the northern flank of their operations around Kiev. For the Soviets, every day the city resisted delayed the tightening encirclement forming around the southwestern front. German preparations for the decisive assault were meticulous. Infantry divisions were reinforced by artillery regiments redeployed from other sectors. Heavy guns, including 210mm howitzers and railway-mounted artillery, were brought into range of the city. Their shells reduced entire blocks to rubble, systematically destroying strong points. The Luftwaffe maintained almost constant pressure. On 10-12 September, waves of bombers struck Chernihiv's central districts, targeting command posts, communication centers, and supply depots. Reconnaissance flights mapped the shrinking Soviet defensive perimeter, while ground attack aircraft provided direct support to advancing troops. The scale of firepower deployed against the city far exceeded that of earlier stages of the siege. German assault tactics were adapted to the difficulties of urban combat. Infantry advanced in small groups, supported by flamethrower teams and demolition squads. Engineers cleared barricades and blasted holes through walls to bypass defended streets. Tanks were committed more aggressively, despite the risks of ambush in narrow streets. Panzer III and IV units, operating in close cooperation with infantry, blasted fortified houses and suppressed machine gun nests. Stuka dive bombers were employed against isolated pockets of resistance, sometimes within a few hundred meters of German lines. The combined arms approach honed in earlier campaigns in Poland and France was applied relentlessly in Chernihiv, though the density of resistance made progress slow and costly. Soviet defenders, reduced to a fraction of their original strength, fought with desperate determination. Reports from the southwestern front indicate that some rifle regiments had fewer than 1,000 men left by mid-September. Machine gun crews operated until overrun, and anti-tank units fought to the last gun. With ammunition nearly exhausted, defenders relied increasingly on grenades, Molotov cocktails, and close-quarters combat. Barricades of rubble and destroyed vehicles were used to block German tanks. Snipers, often young volunteers or NKVD troops, inflicted steady casualties on German patrols. The NKVD maintained discipline in the rear, executing deserters and forcing stragglers back into the line. Worker battalions and militia, many armed only with rifles or even hunting weapons, filled the gaps. Their contribution was militarily limited but symbolically vital, demonstrating that the city would resist to the end. Civilian suffering during this peak of the campaign was immense. Bombardments destroyed water mains and power stations. Fires consumed entire districts, forcing thousands into makeshift shelters in basements and ruins. Food shortages reached critical levels. Civilians survived on minimal rations of bread, often baked from mixed flour substitutes, or whatever could be scavenged from abandoned warehouses. Hospitals were overwhelmed, with wounded soldiers lying untreated for days. Medical staff worked without adequate supplies, performing surgeries without anesthesia. Eyewitness accounts describe overcrowded shelters where disease spread rapidly. Many families, unable to flee, endured bombardments in cellars, emerging only to find their homes destroyed. Civilian casualties by this stage numbered in the thousands, though exact figures remain uncertain. The Wehrmacht pressed assaults from multiple directions. To the north, infantry divisions advanced through villages and forests, gradually closing the ring. To the west, German units expanded their bridgeheads across the Desna, constructing pontoon bridges despite constant Soviet fire. Engineers worked under bombardment to maintain crossings, enabling tanks and artillery to join the offensive. To the south, reconnaissance units pushed toward the roads leading to Kiev, threatening to cut off retreat routes. By 13 to 14 September, Chernihiv was surrounded on three sides, with only narrow corridors to the east remaining open. These were under constant air and artillery fire, making evacuation or reinforcement almost impossible. The Soviet command faced agonizing choices. Orders from the southwestern front and the Stavka demanded continued resistance, but the reality on the ground was collapse. Communications were breaking down. Field telephones were destroyed, and radio operators were killed or cut off. Units often fought in isolation, unaware of the broader situation. Ammunition and food had nearly run out. Attempts to resupply by night convoys across the Desna failed under Luftwaffe bombardment. Still, withdrawal was not authorized. Soviet doctrine at this stage emphasized holding key cities to the last, both for propaganda purposes and to buy time for other fronts. As a result, Chernihiv's defenders were effectively sacrificed to delay German operations. Inside the city, fighting took on the character of block-by-block combat. German patrols advanced cautiously, clearing houses with grenades and flamethrowers. Soviet defenders counterattacked from adjacent buildings, often reoccupying positions abandoned only hours earlier. The destruction was total. Entire streets became piles of rubble, making movement difficult for tanks, but also providing cover for infantry. The defense was depicted as heroic, even as the reality was one of devastation and impending defeat. The peak of the campaign around Chernihiv coincided with critical developments on the wider front. To the south, German forces were closing the encirclement of Kiev, one of the largest battles of the entire war. The defense of Chernihiv played a role in this by diverting German resources and delaying the timetable of certain operations. Though the city could not alter the overall outcome, its resistance forced the Germans to commit divisions that might otherwise have reinforced the encirclement more quickly. Strategically, this delay contributed to the prolonged struggle for Kiev, which ended later in September with the encirclement and destruction of 4 Soviet armies. By 15-16 September, Chernihiv was effectively in ruins. German forces had penetrated the city center, overrunning Soviet headquarters and capturing large numbers of prisoners. The consequences of the siege would extend far beyond the battlefield, shaping both the German occupation and the Soviet memory of resistance in the years to come. With the fall of Chernihiv's central districts and the disintegration of organized Red Army resistance in mid-September 1941, the battle entered a new phase. Although the Wehrmacht had taken control of the city, resistance did not cease. Soviet units cut off during the fighting, NKVD detachments that refused to surrender, and newly formed partisan groups began to wage a campaign of adaptation. This phase did not involve large-scale battles like those that had raged in the streets, but rather a shift towards smaller, irregular forms of warfare and survival under occupation. The contest over Chernihiv was transformed from direct siege into resistance beneath German control. The Red Army remnants played a crucial role in initiating this adaptation. Trained in counterintelligence and security operations, they were better prepared than regular soldiers for clandestine activity. Several NKVD groups avoided capture and retreated into the surrounding countryside. They maintained discipline, established contact with civilians sympathetic to the Soviet cause, and organized safe houses. These groups coordinated the destruction of German depots and the elimination of collaborators. In October, NKVD operatives reportedly set fire to warehouses near the railway station, destroying food and ammunition supplies intended for the Wehrmacht. Their ability to operate inside the occupied city reflected both their training and the willingness of local civilians to provide cover. Civilian adaptation was equally important. The population of Chernihiv, already devastated by bombardment and shortages, faced the reality of German occupation. Requisitions of food, forced labor, and arrests became daily occurrences. To survive, civilians developed strategies of concealment and resistance. Families hid supplies of grain, livestock, and valuables from German foraging units. Women and children carried information between partisan groups and Soviet units across the Desna. Teachers and local officials secretly maintained contact with underground networks. Though the risks were immense, German reprisals often included executions and deportations. The population played an indispensable role in sustaining resistance. Partisan warfare in the Chernihiv region expanded rapidly during the autumn of 1941. The dense forests and swamps provided natural cover, while the river crossings created logistical challenges for the Germans. Partisan detachments targeted bridges, destroyed vehicles, and launched raids on isolated garrisons. On several occasions, they attacked German convoys transporting fuel and ammunition, forcing the Wehrmacht to divert troops for security duties. Small groups of Soviet soldiers and civilians fortified cellars and ruins, conducting sporadic attacks on German patrols. These pockets were gradually eliminated, but their persistence demonstrated the depth of resistance. German commanders reported that even weeks after the city's official fall, firefights still erupted in certain districts. The destruction left by the siege provided cover, making it difficult for occupiers to maintain total control. The ruins of Chernihiv became a landscape of hidden danger, where seemingly pacified streets could erupt into violence without warning. The psychological toll of this period was severe for all participants. German soldiers, expecting a quick consolidation after victory, faced constant anxiety from ambushes and sabotage. Soviet partisans lived under the constant threat of betrayal and reprisals, often enduring hunger and exposure in the forests. Civilians were trapped between occupiers demanding obedience and partisans demanding support. Families were torn apart by suspicion and reprisals. Yet despite the suffering, resistance did not fade. Instead, it adapted to the realities of occupation, creating a protracted struggle that continued long after the siege itself ended. From a military perspective, this phase demonstrated the resilience of Soviet strategy. Though the Red Army had been defeated at Chernihiv, it had succeeded in transforming defeat into prolonged resistance. The delay inflicted on German operations, combined with the emergence of partisans, undermined the efficiency of the Wehrmacht's advance. Strategically, the loss of Chernihiv was overshadowed by the encirclement at Kiev. But the adaptation of resistance in Chernihiv showed how Soviet defense did not end with battlefield defeat. The city became an early example of the dual character of the Eastern Front, conventional battles transitioning into irregular warfare behind enemy lines. By late autumn 1941, Chernihiv had been fully incorporated into the German occupation system, yet the struggle for control was far from resolved. Partisan networks expanded, civilians continued to resist, and the memory of the siege provided a rallying point for defiance. The adaptation of Soviet forces and civilians after the fall of the city ensured that Chernihiv's role in the war extended far beyond the days of bombardment and street fighting. The city, though destroyed and occupied, remained a contested space, its ruins symbolizing not just loss, but also the persistence of resistance. By mid-September 1941, the struggle for Chernihiv reached a decisive turning point. The Soviet defenders, exhausted and depleted after weeks of continuous bombardment and close combat, faced the collapse of their positions. Infantry units advanced systematically, clearing sectors block by block. Flamethrowers and demolition charges eliminated fortified cellars and machine gun nests. Tanks were employed in the main streets to blast through barricades, while artillery leveled entire neighborhoods before infantry moved in. The Luftwaffe continued to bomb the city, though its focus shifted to interdicting the last escape routes and striking concentrations of retreating troops outside the city. The coordination between German ground and air forces ensured that every Soviet attempt to regroup or counterattack was swiftly crushed. The turning point was also linked to the broader strategic situation. By mid-September, Army Group South and Army Group Center were closing the encirclement around Kiev. Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group, which had invested resources in Chernihiv, now pivoted southward to link with forces advancing from the west. This maneuver threatened to cut off the entire southwestern front. The collapse of Soviet control left civilians unprotected, exposed both to the violence of combat and to the harsh measures of occupation that followed. By 15 September, the Soviet command recognized that organized defense was no longer possible. Small groups of soldiers attempted to break out across the Desna at night, but most were killed by German fire or drowned in the river. Others surrendered in large numbers, with thousands of prisoners taken in the final days of fighting. German reports noted the capture of several Soviet generals and large quantities of abandoned equipment. For the defenders, the turning point had passed into total collapse. What had been a prolonged resistance transformed into scattered last stands and chaotic attempts at escape. The capture of Chernihiv thus marked a decisive turning point not only in the local battle, but in the wider campaign. The city, once seen by the Soviets as a defensive anchor, was now firmly in German hands. The Wehrmacht gained control of crucial river crossings and secured its northern approach to Kiev. For the Red Army, the loss of Chernihiv represented the destruction of yet another defensive line and the elimination of entire divisions. Yet the time bought by the defense, several weeks of costly fighting, played a role in delaying German operations and forcing them to divert forces that could have been used elsewhere. The turning point at Chernihiv was therefore double-edged. For the Germans, it was a tactical success, but one achieved at considerable cost and delay. For the Soviets, it was a devastating defeat, but one that contributed indirectly to the broader strategy of buying time at any cost. The ruins of Chernihiv stood as evidence of both destruction and sacrifice. A city reduced to rubble, its defenders annihilated, yet its resistance having forced one of the most powerful armies in the world to bleed and pause before continuing its advance. The fall of Chernihiv in mid-September 1941 brought an end to one of the most protracted urban battles in northern Ukraine during the opening phase of Operation Barbarossa, yet the end of active combat did not signal an end to the suffering. For both armies and the civilian population, the aftermath of the siege was defined by destruction, mass casualties, occupation policies, and the broader consequences of the German advance into Ukraine. The withdrawal of surviving Soviet forces and the imposition of German control marked a new stage in the war for the region. The Soviet withdrawal was chaotic and fragmented. With bridges across the Desna destroyed and German units controlling most approaches, only small groups managed to escape eastward. Many did so at night, attempting to cross the river in boats, rafts, or by swimming. Losses during these attempts were severe. Machine gun fire from German positions and air patrols from the Luftwaffe turned crossings into slaughter. Some units that broke through carried no heavy equipment, abandoning artillery and vehicles. In the final tally, several entire divisions ceased to exist as organized formations. German reports estimated tens of thousands of prisoners taken in the Chernihiv sector, including officers and staff personnel. Soviet records later confirmed catastrophic losses, with entire rifle divisions reporting fewer than 500 men surviving out of initial strengths of 10,000, 12,000. The German occupation of Chernihiv began immediately after the fighting ended. Wehrmacht troops conducted systematic sweeps through the ruins, rounding up prisoners and searching for stragglers. Those captured were marched to improvised camps outside the city, often without food or shelter. Conditions were lethal. Disease and starvation claimed thousands of Soviet prisoners within weeks. Executions of political officers, NKVD members, and suspected partisans were carried out as part of German policy to eliminate resistance. The occupation was marked by brutality from the outset, reflecting the ideological nature of the war in the East. For civilians, the aftermath was catastrophic. Much of Chernihiv lay in ruins, with large sections of the city destroyed by bombardment and fire. Thousands of residents were dead, and many more were wounded or homeless. German occupation authorities immediately imposed strict controls. Food stocks were requisitioned for the Wehrmacht, leaving civilians with minimal rations. Forced labor was introduced, with men and women conscripted to repair roads, clear rubble, and support the occupying forces. Curfews and checkpoints restricted movement, and reprisals were carried out for any suspected partisan activity. Villages in the surrounding countryside were burned if accused of harboring resistance fighters. These measures created a climate of fear, but also deepened resentment, fueling further underground opposition. Despite the devastation, resistance did not disappear. Reports from survivors describe streets littered with corpses, burned houses, and the pervasive stench of death. The trauma of the siege left deep scars on the civilian population, many of whom had lost entire families in the fighting or bombardments. Strategically, the aftermath of the battle for Chernihiv was inseparable from the broader German operations in Ukraine. With the city secured, Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group pivoted south to join Army Group South in encircling Soviet forces around Kiev. The fall of Chernihiv meant that one of the key northern defensive anchors for the southwestern front had been eliminated. The Wehrmacht now possessed stable crossings over the Desna and control of vital road and rail links. This facilitated the rapid advance that culminated in the encirclement of over 600,000 Soviet soldiers at Kiev later in September. In this sense, the sacrifice of Chernihiv's defenders bought time but could not prevent the catastrophic defeat that followed. For the Red Army, the loss of Chernihiv was another in a series of crushing blows during the summer and autumn of 1941. Yet it also demonstrated the capacity for prolonged resistance, even under desperate circumstances. Unlike many towns that fell quickly in the first weeks of Barbarossa, Chernihiv held out for weeks, forcing the Germans to commit significant resources. This delay, while costly for the defenders, contributed to the gradual slowing of the German advance. By the time the Wehrmacht reached Moscow later in the year, the cumulative effect of such delays proved significant. In the immediate aftermath, however, the city endured the full weight of occupation. German authorities installed administrative structures, integrating Chernihiv into the Reichskommissariat Ukraine. The local population was subjected to propaganda that sought to portray German control as liberation from Soviet rule, though the reality was exploitation and repression. By the close of September 1941, Chernihiv had been absorbed into the German-controlled zone. The immediate aftermath was defined by ruin, suffering, and repression, but also by the seeds of continued resistance. For the Wehrmacht, the city represented a tactical victory and a logistical asset. For the Red Army and the Soviet Union, it symbolized both loss and endurance, a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming force, Soviet soldiers and civilians had fought on until collapse. The consequences of the siege would linger long after the last shots were fired, shaping both the occupation experience and the long memory of the Eastern Front. The siege and fall of Chernihiv in September 1941 left behind a legacy that extended far beyond the immediate battle. The city's destruction, the suffering of its inhabitants, and the conduct of both armies made Chernihiv a significant episode within the wider narrative of the Eastern Front. While the Wehrmacht continued its advance, battles like Chernihiv accumulated into a pattern of resistance that undermined the expectation of a rapid Soviet collapse. For the Red Army, the legacy of Chernihiv was twofold. It was both a disaster and a source of inspiration. The loss of the city and the destruction of multiple divisions represented another catastrophic setback during the grim summer of 1941. Tens of thousands of soldiers were killed, captured, or dispersed, while valuable equipment was abandoned. Yet the defense of Chernihiv also showed that Soviet forces could hold major urban centers for extended periods, even when outnumbered and outgunned. The ability to prolong the battle, inflict losses, and force the Germans into costly assaults became a model for later defenses, such as at Moscow and Stalingrad. In Soviet wartime propaganda, Chernihiv was celebrated as a city of heroes, an example of sacrifice for the motherland. This narrative helped to transform a tactical defeat into a moral victory, reinforcing the message that resistance, even in hopeless circumstances, was essential. The civilian legacy of the siege was profound. For the population of Chernihiv, the months of bombardment, famine, and occupation created a trauma that endured long after the war. Thousands were killed during the fighting, and many more perished under German occupation through starvation, forced labor, or reprisals. The destruction of infrastructure left lasting scars. Schools, hospitals, and cultural institutions were reduced to ruins. Families were divided, with some deported to Germany as forced laborers, while others joined partisan units in the forests. After liberation in 1943, the city had to be almost entirely rebuilt, its pre-war fabric permanently altered. The memory of the suffering became embedded in local identity, shaping commemorations and memorials in the post-war decades. The emphasis was on heroism, sacrifice, and the unity of soldiers and civilians in resisting the invader. The darker aspects, such as the scale of civilian casualties, the executions by the NKVD during the retreat, or the suffering of prisoners of war, were downplayed in official accounts. Nevertheless, for local survivors, the memory of bombardments, hunger, and occupation remained vivid. Oral histories collected decades later reveal the enduring trauma of those who lived through the siege. In contemporary historical analysis, the battle for Chernihiv is often overshadowed by larger operations such as the encirclement of Kiev or the Battle of Smolensk. Yet it remains significant as an example of how secondary cities could become focal points of prolonged resistance. Chernihiv's defense illustrates the evolving nature of the Eastern Front. Initial rapid advances by German forces met by increasingly desperate and determined Soviet stands.